What happens when civilization breaks down completely? When ordinary people are forced to choose between their most sacred beliefs and watching their children starve to death. When loving parents must decide whether to eat human flesh or let their babies die. This is the story of 87 people who left Missouri with dreams of California gold and ended up trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, slowly starving, slowly dying, slowly eating each other to survive. This is the story of the Donner Party, and it will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, about survival, about what people are truly capable of when their backs are against the wall and there are no good choices left. In the spring of 1846, these families thought they were heading toward paradise. Instead, they walked straight into hell. And in that hell, they discovered that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than anyone wants to believe. They discovered that love can drive people to commit acts they never thought possible. They discovered that survival has no morals, no rules, no boundaries. They discovered that when you're starving to death, human flesh tastes just like any other meat. This is their story, raw and unfiltered, without sugarcoating or sanitizing. This is what really happened when ordinary American families were pushed beyond the breaking point. Buckle up, because this journey will take you to places you never imagined human beings could go, and by the end, you'll understand that you're capable of the exact same things these people did. Springfield, Illinois, March 1846. The snow was melting, the fields were thawing, and George Donner was making the biggest mistake of his life. At 62 years old, George was everything a man was supposed to be in 1846 America. He owned 300 acres of prime Illinois farmland. He had a beautiful wife named Tamzine who was educated, cultured, and 20 years younger than him. He had 5 daughters who adored him and called him Papa. He had money in the bank, respect in the community, and a future that stretched out before him like a comfortable road with no surprises and no dangers. So why did he decide to risk everything on a 2,000-mile journey across unmapped wilderness to a place he'd never seen? Why did he convince his entire family to abandon their safe, prosperous life for the promise of something better in California? The answer is simple, and it's the same reason people make catastrophic decisions every day: he was bored. George Donner was bored with his comfortable life, bored with his predictable routine, bored with the safety and security he'd worked 30 years to build. He wanted adventure. He wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. He wanted to prove that even at 62, he still had the courage and strength to conquer new frontiers. He had no idea that his desire for adventure would lead to him dying slowly of infection and starvation while his wife fed their children soup made from his own rotting flesh. James Reed was George's best friend and neighbor, but he was everything George wasn't. Where George was calm and measured, James was impulsive and ambitious. Where George was content with what he had, James was always reaching for more. At 45, James had already made and lost several fortunes in various business ventures. He'd fought in the Black Hawk War, built a successful furniture company, invested in real estate, and dabbled in politics. He was the kind of man who couldn't sit still, who was always planning the next deal, the next opportunity, the next chance to prove himself. James had a wife named Margaret who was as ambitious as he was, and 4 children who thought their father could accomplish anything he set his mind to. The Reed family lived in a mansion in Springfield, complete with servants and all the luxuries that money could buy in 1846. But James wanted more. He wanted to be part of history. He wanted to be one of the pioneers who opened up California to American settlement. He wanted his children to grow up in a land of unlimited opportunity rather than the confined, established world of Illinois. He had no idea that his ambition would lead to him murdering a man with a knife, being exiled from the wagon train, and abandoning his family in the wilderness while he fled to save his own life. The other families who joined the Donner Party had their own reasons for leaving everything behind. Patrick and Margaret Breen were Irish immigrants who had come to America with nothing and built a successful farm in Iowa through backbreaking work and careful saving. They had 7 children ranging from 14 years old down to a baby, and they saw California as a chance to give those children opportunities they could never have in Iowa. Patrick was a devout Catholic who believed that God would protect his family no matter what challenges they faced. He kept a diary throughout their journey, documenting every day of their trip with the methodical precision of a man who believed that recording events would somehow help him control them. He had no idea that his diary would become one of the most horrifying documents in American history, chronicling his family's slow descent into starvation and cannibalism with the same careful attention to detail he'd once used to record crop yields and livestock prices. The Murphy family was led by widow Levina Murphy, a tough, resourceful woman who had raised her children alone after her husband's death. She had 2 married daughters with families of their own, plus several younger children still at home. Levina had survived poverty, illness, and single parenthood through sheer determination and an iron will that refused to bend under pressure. She thought she was strong enough to handle anything the trail could throw at her. She had no idea that within a year she would be arguing with her own daughter about which of her grandchildren should be killed and eaten first. The Graves family was perhaps the most optimistic of all. Franklin and Elizabeth Graves had 8 children and were expecting their 9th, but Elizabeth's pregnancy didn't dampen their enthusiasm for the journey. Franklin was a big, strong man who made his living as a gunsmith and blacksmith. He was confident in his ability to protect and provide for his family no matter what circumstances they encountered. Elizabeth was known throughout their Illinois community for her cooking and her hospitality. Their home was always full of friends and neighbors, and Elizabeth took pride in feeding anyone who showed up at her door. She had no idea that within months she would be cooking human flesh in the same pots she'd once used to make Sunday dinners for her church congregation. By April 1846, 87 people had committed to making the journey together. They called themselves the Donner Party because George and Jacob Donner had organized the trip, but they thought of themselves as one big extended family bound together by shared dreams and mutual support. They spent weeks getting to know each other, planning how they would help each other on the trail, and dreaming together about the wonderful life that awaited them in California. The children, especially, became fast friends. Virginia Reed, who was 13, became close with the Donner girls and the Breen children. The younger children played together constantly, forming bonds that their parents believed would last their entire lives. Nobody imagined that within a year, some of these children would be dead and others would be eating their flesh to survive. The departure from Independence, Missouri on April 16, 1846, was like something out of a fairy tale. The wagon train stretched for nearly a mile, with dozens of wagons, hundreds of oxen and cattle, and 87 people who believed they were about to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. James Reed's Pioneer Palace car was the marvel of the entire train. It was basically a house on wheels, 2 stories tall with spring suspension, comfortable beds, a cooking stove, and even a small library. Other families gathered around to admire its innovative design and luxurious appointments. Margaret Reed, who suffered from chronic headaches, could rest comfortably in the wagon's specially designed sleeping compartment while James drove. The children had their own space to play and study. It was like traveling in a mobile mansion, and it made the Reed family the envy of everyone else on the train. What nobody realized was that the wagon's weight and complexity would become major liabilities when the trail got difficult, and that James's pride in his engineering marvel would contribute to the delays that ultimately doomed them all. The first month of travel was everything they had hoped it would be. The weather was perfect, the trail was well marked, and spirits were high. The families settled into a comfortable routine of early morning departures, midday rests, and evening camps where they shared meals and entertainment. The children ran alongside the wagons during the day, collecting wildflowers and interesting rocks. Adults shared stories around the campfire each evening and planned the homes they would build in California. James Reed and George Donner emerged as natural leaders, making decisions about routes and campsites while other family heads contributed their own expertise. Patrick Breen, with his careful nature and strong Catholic faith, became the unofficial chronicler of their journey, recording each day's progress in his diary with methodical precision. The women, led by Margaret Reed and Tamzine Donner, organized communal meals and childcare arrangements that allowed everyone to contribute to the group's welfare while still maintaining their individual family identity. It was a perfect example of American cooperation and community spirit, a wagon train version of the barn-raising tradition where neighbors helped neighbors accomplish tasks that would be impossible for individual families to handle alone. But perfection couldn't last. The first serious problems began in late May when they reached the Platte River Valley and encountered other wagon trains that had left Missouri weeks earlier but were now struggling with broken equipment, sick animals, and dwindling supplies. The Reed family's elaborate wagon, which had been such a source of pride at the beginning of the journey, began to show its limitations when the trail became rough and difficult. Its weight made it harder for the oxen to pull, especially when crossing soft ground or steep hills. Its complexity meant that when something broke, it took longer to fix than simpler wagons. Other families began to grumble that the Reed wagon was slowing down the entire train. James Reed, who had designed the wagon to make the journey easier for his family, found himself constantly defending his decisions and arguing with other members of the group about pace and priorities. These weren't serious conflicts yet, just the kind of minor tensions that develop when people are living in close quarters under stressful conditions. But they were the first cracks in the facade of unity and cooperation that had characterized the early weeks of the journey. The Donner Party was still weeks away from their fateful decision to take the Hastings cutoff, but the seeds of that decision were already being planted in arguments about efficiency, speed, and the best way to ensure everyone's safety and success. By June, they had reached Fort Laramie in Wyoming, a major trading post and resupply point on the Oregon Trail. This should have been a celebration, a chance to rest and restock before the most difficult part of their journey. Instead, it became the site of more arguments and disagreements about their route and their leadership. Other wagon trains at the fort were talking about various cutoffs and alternative routes that supposedly offered advantages over the main trail. Some promised shorter distances. Others claimed better grass for the animals or more reliable water sources. A few were said to avoid the most difficult mountain passes that lay ahead. James Reed, always interested in innovation and efficiency, began collecting information about these alternatives and discussing them with other family heads. The most intriguing possibility was something called the Hastings Cutoff, named after Lansford Hastings, a lawyer and promoter who claimed to have discovered a route that would save them weeks of travel time and get them to California before winter weather made the mountain passes dangerous. Hastings had written a guidebook called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, that described his route in glowing terms and provided detailed instructions for following it. Reed studied the guidebook carefully and discussed it with George Donner and other leaders. The route looked promising on paper, and Hastings wrote with such confidence and authority that it was easy to believe he knew what he was talking about. The cutoff would branch off from the main trail at a place called Fort Bridger, head southwest through the Wasatch Mountains and around the south end of the Great Salt Lake, then rejoin the main California Trail near the Humboldt River. According to Hastings, this route was not only shorter but also easier, with better grass, more water, and fewer steep mountain passes. For families with young children, elderly relatives, and pregnant mothers, those advantages could make the difference between a successful journey and a disaster. What James Reed and the other Donner Party leaders didn't know was that Lansford Hastings was essentially a con man who was promoting California real estate and needed settlers to increase land values. He had never actually traveled the route he was promoting, having pieced it together from maps and second-hand accounts without ever testing it with wagons and families. His guidebook was basically a work of fiction designed to attract immigrants to California, not a reliable source of information for people whose lives would depend on its accuracy. But the Donner Party had no way of knowing this. All they knew was that the route looked good on paper and promised to save them time and effort at a point in their journey when time and effort were becoming increasingly precious commodities. The decision about whether to take the Hastings cutoff would be made later, at Fort Bridger, but the discussions at Fort Laramie planted the idea in everyone's minds and began the process of weighing risks against potential benefits that would ultimately doom them all. The journey from Fort Laramie to Fort Bridger took them through some of the most beautiful country any of them had ever seen, but also some of the most challenging. The trail wound through the Rocky Mountains, crossing steep passes and following narrow valleys where a single mistake could send a wagon tumbling down a cliff. The weather became increasingly unpredictable, with sudden storms that could turn a pleasant morning into a nightmare of mud, hail, and lightning. The animals began to show signs of strain from weeks of constant travel over increasingly difficult terrain. Several oxen died from exhaustion or injury, forcing families to redistribute loads and reorganize their wagon trains. The first human casualty came in early July when Sarah Keyes, Margaret Reed's elderly mother, died of natural causes after a long illness. Her death was not unexpected, and she was given a proper burial with prayers and mourning that reflected the group's continuing commitment to civilized behavior and Christian values. But her death also marked the beginning of a pattern that would accelerate dramatically once they became trapped in the mountains. Each death would force the survivors to confront questions about resource allocation, moral obligations, and the balance between individual needs and group welfare that would become increasingly difficult to answer as their situation deteriorated. Sarah Keyes was buried in a marked grave with a wooden cross and a prayer service that the entire wagon train attended. Within months, people would be digging up graves and eating the contents without ceremony or remorse, but at this point, the idea of desecrating a human body for any reason was still unthinkable to everyone in the group. They reached Fort Bridger on July 28, 1846, and found a note from Lansford Hastings encouraging them to follow his cut-off route and promising to wait for them at Weber Canyon to guide them through the most difficult sections. The note was optimistic and reassuring, written in the confident tone of a man who had complete faith in his own expertise and judgment. Hastings claimed that his route was not only shorter and easier than the main trail, but also safer, with fewer river crossings and mountain passes that could become dangerous in bad weather. He estimated that taking his cutoff would save them 3 to 4 weeks of travel time, getting them to California in early September rather than late September or early October. For families who were already concerned about the approaching winter, those extra weeks could make the difference between arriving in comfort and arriving in crisis. The decision to take the Hastings cutoff was made after long discussions among all the family heads, with everyone having a chance to voice their opinions and concerns. Some argued for sticking with the proven main trail, pointing out that thousands of people had already used it successfully and that the route was well mapped and well supplied. Others, led by James Reed and George Donner, argued for taking the calculated risk of trying Hastings as alternative, emphasizing the potential benefits of arriving in California earlier with more time to establish themselves before winter. The final vote was close, but the majority decided to trust Hastings and take his cutoff. It was a decision made by intelligent, responsible people who thought they were acting in the best interests of their families and their group. They had no way of knowing that they were voting to condemn themselves to months of suffering that would end with them eating each other to survive. They had no way of knowing that Lansford Hastings was already 100 miles ahead of them, struggling through the same route with another wagon train and discovering that his promised shortcut was actually longer, more dangerous, and nearly impossible to navigate with wagons and families. But Hastings wasn't about to admit his mistake. His reputation, his business ventures, and his entire future depended on convincing people that his route worked. So when later wagon trains like the Donner Party reached Fort Bridger, they found encouraging notes rather than honest warnings about the difficulties ahead. The Donner Party loaded their wagons, kissed goodbye to the safety and certainty of the main trail, and headed southwest into territory that few white men had ever seen and none had successfully crossed with families and wagons. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came almost immediately after they left Fort Bridger. The trail that Hastings had described as well-marked and easy to follow was barely a trail at all in many places. Dense forests blocked their path, forcing them to stop and cut trees for hours just to advance a few hundred yards. Steep ravines required them to lower their wagons down with ropes, a dangerous and time-consuming process that tested everyone's strength and patience. The route that Hastings had estimated would take a few days to complete stretched into weeks as they struggled through terrain that seemed designed to prevent any human passage. The delays began to mount exponentially. A day here, a week there, until they were significantly behind their planned schedule and burning through supplies that were supposed to last them until they reached California. Their carefully calculated 4-month journey was turning into something much longer and more dangerous, and they all knew it but couldn't do anything to stop it. The animals suffered the most from the difficult terrain and extended travel time. Oxen that had been strong and healthy at the beginning of the journey began to weaken from the constant strain of pulling heavy wagons over rough ground. Several died from exhaustion or injury, forcing families to abandon possessions and redistribute loads among the surviving animals. The loss of each ox was a serious blow to the family that owned it, but it was also a problem for the entire group because they depended on each other for mutual support and shared resources. James Reed's elaborate Pioneer Palace car, which had been such a source of pride and comfort at the beginning of the journey, became a major liability in the difficult terrain of the Hastings Cutoff. Its weight and size made it much harder to maneuver than simpler wagons, and it required more oxen to pull it over steep hills and soft ground. Other families began to openly resent the delays caused by Reed's wagon, and Reed himself began to realize that his engineering marvel was becoming a burden rather than an asset. The psychological strain of the delays and difficulties began to show in shorter tempers, more frequent arguments, and a general breakdown of the cooperative spirit that had characterized the early weeks of their journey. People who had been friends and neighbors began to blame each other for their problems. Families that had shared resources and supported each other began to hoard supplies and look out primarily for their own interests. The children, who had been playing together and forming friendships, began to reflect the tensions and divisions of their parents. The worst part of the Hastings Cutoff was the section that took them around the south end of the Great Salt Lake, through a desert that Hastings had described as a minor inconvenience but which turned out to be one of the most brutal environments any of them had ever experienced. For 80 miles, they struggled across salt flats and alkali dust under a blazing sun that seemed to suck the life out of everything it touched. There was no water for the animals, no grass for them to eat, no shade for the people to rest in. The heat was so intense that it caused metal wagon parts to become too hot to touch and made the wooden wheels shrink and crack. For 5 days and 4 nights, they struggled across this wasteland, watching their animals collapse and die from thirst and exhaustion while their own water supplies dwindled to dangerously low levels. Children cried constantly from thirst and heat exhaustion. Adults became delirious from dehydration. Several families had to abandon cherished possessions to lighten their loads and help their remaining animals survive the crossing. The Reed family was forced to abandon one of their wagons entirely, losing furniture, books, and personal belongings that had been with them since Illinois. Margaret Reed, already weakened by her chronic illness, nearly died during the desert crossing. Her children, especially the younger ones, suffered from severe dehydration that left them weak and sick for weeks afterward. James Reed, watching his family suffer and seeing his carefully planned journey turning into a nightmare, began to realize the full magnitude of the mistake he had made in trusting Hastings's guidebook. By the time they finally escaped the desert and reached the Humboldt River, they had lost dozens of cattle and oxen, abandoned multiple wagons, and consumed weeks of extra time that they couldn't afford to lose. They were supposed to be in California by now, setting up their new homes and preparing for winter. Instead, they were still hundreds of miles from their destination, traveling with depleted supplies and weakened animals through territory that was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The stress and exhaustion of the desert crossing had pushed everyone to their breaking points, and the cooperative spirit that had once characterized their group was rapidly disappearing. Families that had once shared everything now guarded their remaining supplies jealously. People who had once been friends began to blame each other for their problems and question each other's decisions and motivations. The children, who had once played together happily, now reflected the tensions and divisions of their parents. It was during this period of maximum stress and minimum resources that the first serious violence erupted among the members of the Donner Party. On October 5, 1846, near the Humboldt River in what is now Nevada, a simple disagreement about wagon placement escalated into murder. John Snyder, one of the teamsters hired to help drive the wagons, got into an argument with James Reed about whose wagon should have the right-of-way on a particularly difficult section of trail. Both men were exhausted, frustrated, and pushed beyond their normal limits of patience and self-control. The argument started over something trivial but quickly escalated as weeks of accumulated stress and resentment came pouring out. Snyder, who was 25 years old and known for his quick temper, struck Reed across the head with his whip handle, opening a gash that bled profusely and left Reed dazed and disoriented. Reed, acting on instinct and rage rather than rational thought, drew the knife he carried on his belt and struck back, driving the blade into Snyder's chest just below the ribs. The wound was deep and severe, cutting through vital organs and causing massive internal bleeding. Snyder collapsed within minutes and died despite frantic efforts to save him. The entire wagon train was stunned by the sudden eruption of violence among people who had been living together like family for months. These were civilized, Christian people who had never experienced serious violence and didn't know how to process the horror of what had just happened. Some immediately called for Reed to be hanged on the spot, arguing that murder couldn't be tolerated in their small community and that swift justice was necessary to prevent further violence. Others argued that it had been self-defense, pointing out that Snyder had struck first and that Reed had acted to protect himself from further attack. The debate that followed was one of the most intense and divisive in the entire journey, with families taking sides and friendships being destroyed over questions of justice, revenge, and group survival. The trial was held right there beside the trail, with the entire wagon train serving as judge and jury. Witnesses testified about what they had seen, character witnesses spoke for both the dead man and the accused, and everyone argued passionately about what should be done. Some wanted Reed executed immediately. Others wanted him forgiven and allowed to continue with the group. Still others proposed various forms of punishment short of death, including banishment, financial compensation to Snyder's family, or forced labor for the benefit of the group. The discussion went on for hours, with tempers flaring and accusations flying as people tried to balance their desire for justice with their need to hold the group together. In the end, they reached a compromise that satisfied nobody but seemed like the only option that would prevent the group from splitting apart entirely. James Reed would be banished from the wagon train, forced to leave his family and ride ahead to California alone. He would not be executed, but he would be stripped of his leadership role and expelled from the community that had been his life for the past 5 months. The decision was announced with tears and angry words from people on both sides of the issue. Reed's supporters felt that he was being punished too harshly for defending himself. Snyder's supporters felt that Reed was getting away with murder. Everyone agreed that something terrible had happened to their group, something that couldn't be undone or forgotten. The farewell between James Reed and his family was devastating to witness. Margaret Reed, despite her own illness and fear, showed incredible strength as she kissed her husband goodbye and promised to take care of their children until they could all be reunited in California. The children, especially the younger ones, couldn't understand why their father was being forced to leave them. Virginia Reed, who was 13 and old enough to understand the severity of the situation, broke down completely as she watched her father prepare to ride away into the wilderness alone. James Reed promised his family that he would find help in California and organize a rescue party to come back for them, but everyone knew that promise might be impossible to keep. The trail ahead was dangerous and uncertain, winter was approaching, and Reed would be traveling alone through territory where a single mistake could mean death. When Reed finally rode away from the wagon train on October 9, he took with him not just his own broken heart but the hopes and prayers of everyone who loved him. The remaining members of the group, now numbering 86 instead of 87, tried to close ranks and continue their journey as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The murder of John Snyder and the banishment of James Reed had shattered the illusion of unity and cooperation that had sustained them through the first months of their journey. They were no longer one big happy family heading toward a shared dream. They were a collection of frightened, exhausted people who had learned that they were capable of violence and betrayal under pressure. The leadership of the group shifted to George Donner and other family patriarchs, but the easy consensus that had characterized their early decision-making was gone forever. Every choice now became a source of conflict and debate as different families pursued their own interests and blamed others for their problems. The murder had also cost them one of their most capable leaders at a time when leadership was desperately needed. James Reed, whatever his faults, had been an organizer and decision-maker who could see the big picture and plan for the future. Without him, the group struggled to coordinate their activities and make the hard choices that their increasingly desperate situation required. By mid-October, they were months behind schedule, dangerously low on supplies, and facing the approach of winter with hundreds of miles still to travel. Their animals were weak and dying. Their wagons were falling apart. Their food was running out. And they were still weeks away from the Sierra Nevada mountains, which they would have to cross before winter snow made passage impossible. The psychological toll of their situation was beginning to show in shorter tempers, more frequent arguments, and a general breakdown of the social norms that had governed their behavior since leaving Missouri. People who had once been generous and cooperative became selfish and suspicious. Families that had once shared everything began to hoard their remaining supplies. Children who had once played together happily now reflected the tensions and divisions of their parents. The first signs of the desperation that would later drive them to cannibalism were already appearing in the form of ruthless resource allocation and the abandonment of weaker members of the group. When they finally reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada on October 12, they should have been celebrating their arrival at the final obstacle before California. Instead, they were racing against time, trying to cross the mountains before winter snow made passage impossible. The weather was already turning cold, with frost appearing on their wagons in the morning and ice forming on water containers at night. Everyone knew that they were cutting it dangerously close, but they also knew that they had no choice but to push forward and hope for the best. The trail up into the mountains was steep, rocky, and difficult even under the best of circumstances. With weakened animals, damaged wagons, and exhausted people, it became a nightmare of constant struggle and frequent delays. Every day brought new mechanical problems, new injuries to animals and people, and new evidence that they were fighting a losing battle against time and terrain. The psychological pressure was enormous as everyone realized that their survival now depended on reaching the top of the mountains before the winter storms began. On October 28, they reached Truckee Lake, a beautiful alpine lake surrounded by towering peaks that normally would have taken their breath away with its natural splendor. Under their circumstances, however, the lake represented a trap that might become their tomb. The pass that led over the mountains and down into California was steep, narrow, and blocked by early snow that made travel dangerous for wagons and families. After months of struggle and delay, they had finally run out of time. Winter had caught them in the mountains, and they had no choice but to stop and wait for conditions to improve. The decision to make camp beside the lake seemed reasonable at the time. They were exhausted from months of travel, their animals needed rest, and the early snow would surely melt within a few days, allowing them to complete their journey in safety. They had supplies for several weeks, shelters that could protect them from the weather, and the hope that their situation was only a temporary setback rather than a permanent trap. They had no way of knowing that this winter would be one of the worst in recorded history, with snow falling almost continuously from November through March and accumulating to depths that would make travel impossible until spring. They had no way of knowing that their temporary camp would become a prison where they would spend 6 months slowly starving, slowly dying, and slowly eating each other to survive. The first snow began falling on October 31, 1846, Halloween night. At first, it seemed like a minor inconvenience, just a few inches that would melt quickly once the sun came out. But the snow kept falling, day after day, night after night, until the landscape around them disappeared under a white blanket that grew deeper and deeper with each passing storm. By November, the snow was 6 feet deep. By December, it was 12 feet deep. By January, it was 20 feet deep in some places, completely burying their shelters and making the world outside an alien landscape of white silence broken only by the howling wind and the distant sound of trees snapping under the weight of accumulated snow. The families split into groups based on space availability and personal relationships, setting up separate camps that would become the sites of their individual struggles for survival. The Breen family, led by Patrick and Margaret, moved into a cabin that had been abandoned by previous travelers. It was small, drafty, and primitive, but it offered more protection from the weather than anything they could build themselves. Patrick continued keeping his diary with methodical precision, recording each day's events and weather conditions as if documenting their situation would somehow help him control it. The Murphy family, led by widow Levi Murphy, claimed another small cabin nearby. Levi was a tough, resourceful woman who had survived poverty and single parenthood through sheer determination, but even she was unprepared for the challenges they would face in the months ahead. Her cabin housed not only her own family but also several other people who had nowhere else to go, creating overcrowded conditions that would become increasingly unbearable as their situation deteriorated. The Graves family built a lean-to against the Murphy cabin, using wagon parts and whatever lumber they could salvage to create a shelter that was barely adequate for normal weather conditions. Elizabeth Graves was 8 months pregnant and struggling with the physical demands of their situation, but she continued to care for her 8 children with remarkable strength and determination. The Reed family, now without their father and patriarch, was taken in by other families who shared their shelters and supplies out of compassion and Christian charity. Margaret Reed and her 4 children became completely dependent on the kindness of others, a situation that was both humbling and terrifying for a woman who had been accustomed to comfort and security. The other families were scattered among various makeshift shelters built from wagon parts, canvas, and whatever timber they could gather. Most of these structures were little more than holes in the ground covered with tarps and branches, offering minimal protection from the weather and even less privacy or comfort. 5 miles away at Alder Creek, the Donner families established their own camp when George Donner suffered a severe hand injury while trying to repair a broken wagon axle. The cut became infected, and George was too weak and sick to travel. His wife Tamzine, despite being an educated woman who had never done manual labor, worked tirelessly to care for her injured husband and their 5 daughters while also helping with the general survival needs of their group. The separation of the Donner families from the main group at the lake was both practical and tragic. Practical because George was too sick to travel, but tragic because it divided their already small community and made mutual support much more difficult. The 5 miles between the 2 camps might as well have been 500 miles once the snow got deep enough to make travel nearly impossible. As November turned into December and December turned into January, the snow continued to fall with relentless persistence. The world outside their shelters became an alien landscape of white silence where nothing moved except the wind and the occasional avalanche of snow falling from overladen tree branches. The lake froze solid, and the surrounding peaks disappeared into clouds that seemed to promise nothing but more snow and more cold. Their food supplies, which had been carefully calculated to last until they reached California, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. They had planned for a 4-month journey, not a winter-long siege in the mountains. The extra months of travel caused by the Hastings cutoff delays had already consumed much of their surplus, and now they faced the prospect of spending the entire winter in the mountains with what little remained. They slaughtered their remaining cattle and oxen, but the meat had to be rationed carefully to last as long as possible. A family of 6 might have only a few ounces of beef per day, barely enough to prevent immediate starvation but nowhere near enough to maintain health and strength in sub-zero temperatures. The children began to show signs of malnutrition first because their small bodies couldn't survive long without adequate nutrition, especially in the harsh conditions they were facing. Their hair started falling out in clumps. Their teeth became loose and began to fall out. Their skin turned yellow and then gray as their bodies began consuming their own tissue for energy. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls, giving them the appearance of tiny skeletons covered with skin. Some became too weak to stand or walk. Others developed a strange lethargy where they would stare at nothing for hours, their minds shutting down to conserve energy for basic biological functions. Their parents watched helplessly as their babies slowly died of hunger, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The beef was gone by early December, but they found other things to eat. They killed and ate their dogs, which provided a few more days of protein but also eliminated their companions and sources of warmth. They caught and ate mice, rats, and any other small animals they could find, but these provided almost no nutrition and were barely worth the energy it took to catch them. They boiled leather from shoes, harnesses, and wagon covers into a glutinous soup that filled their stomachs temporarily but provided virtually no nutritional value. They stripped bark from trees and tried to make it edible by boiling it for hours, but it remained indigestible and often made them sick. They dug through 15 feet of snow looking for anything that might be edible, old bones, scraps of hide, anything that might provide a few calories to keep them alive for another day. But nothing was enough. Nothing could replace the thousands of calories they were burning each day just trying to stay warm in temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. Their bodies began consuming themselves, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic biological functions, cannibalizing their own organs to keep their hearts beating and their lungs breathing for just one more day. The first death came on December 15 when Bayless Williams, a 25-year-old man who had worked as a handyman for the Reed family, finally succumbed to starvation and exposure. He had been weakening for weeks, growing thinner and weaker each day as his body consumed itself from the inside out. When he died, he weighed less than 90 pounds, his body reduced to little more than skin stretched over bones. The entire community gathered for his burial, digging through frozen ground with tools that broke against the rock-hard earth. They said prayers over his grave and marked it with a wooden cross, still clinging to the belief that Christian burial was important, that maintaining their humanity and dignity mattered even in their desperate circumstances. They had no idea that within weeks, some of them would be digging up his body and eating it. Franklin Ward Graves died next, on Christmas Eve, leaving behind his pregnant wife Elizabeth and their 8 children. Frank had been the strongest man in the group, a blacksmith with powerful arms and a barrel chest who had seemed invincible when they left Illinois. But starvation doesn't discriminate based on strength or character. His body consumed his muscle mass first, then his organs, until there was nothing left to keep him alive. His death was particularly devastating because he had been one of the group's leaders and primary providers. Elizabeth, now widowed and facing the birth of her 9th child in conditions that made survival unlikely for healthy adults, became completely dependent on the charity of others who had almost nothing to give. Then came Spitzer, a German immigrant who had joined the party as a teamster. Then Dolan, an Irishman who had been working for the Murphy family. Then Fosdick, who was married to one of Levi Now Murphy's daughters. Each death brought the survivors a little closer to a decision they had been trying not to think about, a line they had sworn they would never cross. Each burial became a little more perfunctory as the living grew too weak to dig proper graves or conduct elaborate ceremonies. The bodies were wrapped in blankets or canvas and buried in shallow graves that were immediately covered by fresh snow, marking the locations where they lay but also making them easy to find again when desperation finally overcame moral restraint. By mid-December, people were having conversations that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Levi Now Murphy was the first to say it out loud, probably because she was tough enough to voice what everyone else was thinking but afraid to articulate. The bodies of the dead could keep the living alive. It wasn't murder, she argued. These people were already dead. It was just meat. Protein. The difference between survival and death for the children who were still breathing but wouldn't be for much longer if something didn't change soon. The debate that followed was agonizing and divisive, tearing apart relationships and friendships that had been forged over months of shared hardship. Some families absolutely refused to even consider it. Patrick Breen, whose Catholic faith had sustained him through every trial, declared that he would rather die and meet his Maker with a clean soul than live as a cannibal. His wife Margaret supported him, saying that they would trust in God's plan rather than violate the most fundamental taboo of Christian civilization. Other families, driven by the sight of their starving children and the sound of their constant crying for food that didn't exist, began to argue that God would forgive them for doing whatever was necessary to survive. After all, they reasoned, hadn't God provided manna for the Israelites in the wilderness? Wasn't saving the lives of innocent children more important than preserving abstract moral principles? The most heart-wrenching arguments came from the parents who were watching their children waste away before their eyes. Margaret Reed, who had once lived in a mansion with servants and never worried about where her next meal would come from, was now watching her 4 children slowly starve to death while the frozen corpses of their friends lay just outside their shelter. How could she explain to her 13-year-old daughter Virginia that moral principles were more important than survival when Virginia was so weak she could barely stand? How could she tell her 8-year-old son James that eating human flesh was wrong when he was crying from hunger every night and begging for food she didn't have? The decision, when it finally came, wasn't made by the group as a whole. It was made by individuals, by families, by mothers and fathers who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance and faced a simple choice: cross this line or watch their children die. And once that line was crossed, once the first piece of human flesh was cut from the first frozen corpse and cooked over the first fire, everything changed forever. The first family to break the taboo was probably the Murphys, although exact details were never recorded because nobody wanted to document the moment when they stopped being civilized human beings and became something else entirely. Levi Na Murphy, who had suggested it first, was also probably the first to act on her suggestion. She took a knife to one of the frozen corpses, probably Spitzer since he had no family to object, and cut away pieces of flesh from his arms and legs. The meat was frozen solid, so it had to be thawed over a fire before it could be cooked. The smell of cooking human flesh filled their shelter, a smell that was simultaneously nauseating and appetizing because it represented the first real food they had smelled in weeks. Some people vomited immediately when they tried to eat it. Others forced it down and kept it down because they understood that their lives depended on it. The children were told it was beef or some other kind of normal meat, but many of them were old enough to know better. Virginia Reed, who was 13, certainly understood what she was eating when her mother finally gave in and began feeding human flesh to her family. The younger children might have been fooled initially, but they learned quickly enough when they saw the bones and recognized them as human rather than animal. Once the first family had broken the taboo, it became easier for others to follow. Within days, most of the families at the lake were supplementing their meager rations with human flesh cut from the growing number of corpses that surrounded their shelters. They developed techniques for processing the bodies most efficiently, removing the flesh in strips that could be dried over fires to preserve it for future consumption. They learned which parts of the body provided the most nutrition and which were easiest to prepare and digest. They discovered that the organs, especially the liver and kidneys, were more nutritious than muscle tissue but also more difficult to stomach for people who weren't accustomed to eating such things. They found that the brains were rich in fats and proteins but required cracking open the skull with rocks or axes, a process that was both physically demanding and psychologically traumatic even for people who had already crossed the line into cannibalism. They learned that children's flesh was more tender than adult flesh, a discovery that led to horrible conversations about which children were most likely to die next and whether it was better to wait for natural death or help the process along to ensure fresher meat. The cannibalism wasn't limited to adults who had died of natural causes. As the winter progressed and more people died, the survivors began to make distinctions between different types of human meat based on the circumstances of death and the condition of the corpse. Fresh meat from someone who had just died was preferable to meat from someone who had been dead for days or weeks. Meat from healthy young people was more nutritious than meat from the sick and elderly. Meat from people who had died of starvation was less desirable than meat from people who had died of other causes because starvation victims had already consumed much of their own body fat and muscle tissue. These calculations led to increasingly horrifying behavior as the winter progressed. People began to watch each other carefully, evaluating who was most likely to die next and making mental notes about which corpses would provide the best nutrition. The sick and elderly, who had once been cared for and protected by the community, now found themselves viewed as potential food sources by people who were themselves slowly dying of hunger. The psychological toll of sustained cannibalism was enormous and affected different people in different ways. Some, like Louis Keseberg, seemed to adapt to it quickly and even develop a taste for human flesh. Keseberg would later claim that he actually preferred human meat to beef or pork, saying it was more tender and flavorful. Others, like Patrick Breen, resisted as long as possible before finally giving in to save their children, then struggled with guilt and self-loathing for the rest of their lives. The children who survived were perhaps the most tragically affected because they learned at the most impressionable age that all moral boundaries could be crossed, that all taboos could be broken, that survival justified any action no matter how horrible. Some never recovered from the psychological trauma of eating human flesh and watching their parents become cannibals. Others buried their memories so deep that they convinced themselves it had never happened, creating elaborate alternative narratives about what they had eaten during the winter to avoid confronting the truth about their own actions. The social dynamics of the group changed completely once cannibalism became normalized. Families that had once shared everything began to guard their human meat supplies jealously, worried that others would steal their corpses or take more than their fair share of the flesh. Arguments broke out over who had the right to consume which bodies, with some families claiming exclusive rights to their own deceased relatives while others argued for communal sharing of all available human meat. The strongest and most ruthless members of the group began to dominate the weaker ones, taking the best cuts of meat and leaving others with scraps and bones. Louis Keseberg, in particular, became a figure of fear and suspicion because he seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of human flesh while others were still starving. People began to whisper that he was killing the weak and sick rather than waiting for them to die naturally, but nobody was strong enough or organized enough to confront him directly. The breakdown of moral restraints that accompanied cannibalism led to other forms of behavior that would have been unthinkable earlier in their journey. People who had once been generous and cooperative became selfish and suspicious. Lying and theft became common as individuals pursued their own survival at the expense of others. The social contracts and mutual agreements that had held their community together dissolved as everyone focused on personal and family survival above all other considerations. Sexual behavior also changed as normal social restraints disappeared. There were reports of inappropriate relationships developing between people who were thrown together in intimate circumstances by their shared shelters and common desperation. The normal boundaries between families and between adults and children became blurred as people sought comfort and companionship in whatever forms were available. Violence became more common as people fought over resources, argued about decisions, and took out their frustrations on each other. The murder of John Snyder back in October had been shocking because it was so unusual. By January, threats and physical confrontations were routine parts of daily life in the camps. On December 16, 15 of the strongest survivors made the desperate decision to attempt crossing the mountains on foot to bring back help. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, and the name was grimly appropriate because everyone understood that their chances of success were minimal. They strapped makeshift snowshoes to their feet, took what little food they could carry, and set out into the wilderness with the slim hope of reaching California before they died of exhaustion or exposure. The Forlorn Hope included both men and women, a decision that was controversial because many people believed that women weren't strong enough for such a journey. But the women argued that they had just as much right to attempt escape as the men, and some claimed that they might actually have better chances of survival because they were smaller and required fewer calories to maintain basic body functions. Among the women was Sarah Fosdick, who was pregnant but insisted on going because she believed it was her best chance of saving both herself and her unborn child. Also in the group was Harriet Pike, whose husband had died earlier in the winter and who felt that making this attempt was better than waiting to die slowly in the camps. The journey of the Forlorn Hope became an epic of human endurance and cannibalism that paralleled what was happening back at the lake but under even more extreme conditions. They carried enough food for 6 days, expecting to reach safety within a week. Instead, they spent 33 days struggling through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, and they only survived by eating each other. The food ran out on their 4th day in the mountains. They were still deep in the wilderness, still weeks away from any help, and they had nothing left to eat. That night, as they huddled around a small fire in the snow, they faced the same terrible decision that their families back at the lake were confronting. When Franklin Ward Graves died of exhaustion on Christmas Day, they didn't bury him. They couldn't have buried him even if they had wanted to because the ground was frozen solid under 10 feet of snow. Instead, they did what they had to do to survive. They cut strips of flesh from his body, dried them over their fire, and ate them. It was Christmas Day, 1846, and they were celebrating the birth of Christ by consuming human flesh to stay alive. But the Forlorn Hope's experience with cannibalism was even more extreme than what was happening at the lake because they were constantly moving, constantly burning calories, and constantly facing new deaths that provided fresh meat. When Antoine, one of their guides, died a few days after Graves, they ate him too. When Patrick Dolan died of exposure, they consumed his body as well. As the deaths mounted and the surviving members of the group grew more desperate, they began to make calculations about who was most likely to die next and whose death would provide the most nutrition for the survivors. The social bonds that had once held them together completely dissolved as cannibalism became not just a response to death but a strategy for survival that involved selecting victims. Luis and Salvador, two Native American guides who had been helping the group navigate the mountains, sensed what was coming and tried to escape when they realized that their companions were beginning to view them as potential food sources rather than fellow human beings. They were tracked down and killed by William Foster, who shot them both with a rifle and then butchered their bodies for meat. Foster later claimed that the guides had been trying to steal food or abandon the group, but everyone knew the real reason. Luis and Salvador represented fresh meat for people who were starving to death, and Foster was willing to commit murder to secure that meat for himself and his family. The killing of Luis and Salvador marked a crucial turning point in the Forlorn Hope's journey because it represented the transition from survival cannibalism, where they ate people who had died naturally, to predatory cannibalism, where they killed people to eat them. Once that line was crossed, everyone in the group became a potential victim rather than a companion. People began to sleep with one eye open, worried that they might be murdered in their sleep by someone who viewed them as their next meal. The strongest members of the group, particularly the men, began to dominate the women and weaker members through threats and intimidation. Foster, who had proven his willingness to kill for meat, became the de facto leader of the group through fear rather than consensus. Others deferred to his decisions because they were afraid of becoming his next victims if they opposed him. The psychological toll of murder and cannibalism on the Forlorn Hope was even more severe than what was experienced by the families back at the lake. They were not only eating human flesh but also participating in the selection and killing of their victims. They were not only abandoning their moral principles but actively violating them through premeditated murder. The guilt and trauma that resulted from these actions would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When 7 members of the Forlorn Hope finally stumbled into a California settlement on January 17, 1847, they were barely recognizable as human beings. They were emaciated skeletons covered with skin, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls, their hair falling out in clumps. They could barely speak coherently, and when they tried to explain what had happened to them, their stories seemed too horrible to believe. The people who rescued them were shocked not only by their physical condition but also by their behavior. The survivors grabbed food with their bare hands and stuffed it into their mouths like animals, having forgotten the basic social conventions around eating. They hoarded scraps and became aggressive when anyone tried to take food away from them, even when they had eaten enough to make themselves sick. They seemed to have lost the ability to trust other people or to function in normal social situations. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to have developed a taste for human flesh that persisted even after they had access to normal food. Several of the survivors made comments about missing the taste of human meat or comparing beef and pork unfavorably to the human flesh they had been eating for weeks. These comments horrified their rescuers and contributed to the stigma that would follow the Donner Party survivors for the rest of their lives. Despite their own horrific ordeal, the survivors of the Forlorn Hope immediately began organizing rescue parties to go back for the families they had left behind at the lake. They knew that conditions at the camps were even worse than what they had experienced during their escape, and they understood that time was running out for the people still trapped in the mountains. James Reed, who had been living in California since his banishment from the wagon train back in October, was among the first to volunteer for the rescue missions. Despite everything that had happened, despite the circumstances that had forced him to abandon his family, his love for them and for all the members of the Donner Party was stronger than his desire for safety and comfort. The first rescue party reached Truckee Lake on February 18, 1847, and what they found there was beyond anything they had imagined. The snow was so deep that only the tops of some cabins were visible above the surface. Smoke rising from holes in the snow was the only indication that anyone was still alive down below. When the rescuers called out, weak voices answered from beneath the snow, but it took hours of digging to reach the cabin doors. What they found when they finally broke through into the shelters was a scene from hell. Emaciated human beings who looked more like walking skeletons than living people. Children with the hollow eyes and distended bellies of severe malnutrition. Adults who could barely speak above a whisper because they lacked the strength for normal conversation. And everywhere, scattered around the shelters like firewood, were human bones that had been cracked open and picked clean. The rescuers tried to hide their shock and horror, but it was impossible to maintain composure in the face of such devastation. They had known that the Donner Party was in trouble, but they hadn't been prepared for the complete breakdown of civilization that they witnessed in the camps. These weren't people anymore. They were survivors who had crossed every moral boundary and abandoned every social convention in their desperate struggle to stay alive. Margaret Reed was found in the Murphy cabin, cutting steaks from a human leg when the rescue party arrived. She looked up at the men who had come to save her and calmly asked if they were hungry, offering to cook them some of what she claimed was excellent meat. Her children were playing nearby, their faces smeared with grease and blood, gnawing on human bones as if they were eating chicken at a Sunday picnic. The casual, matter-of-fact way that the survivors treated cannibalism was perhaps more shocking to the rescuers than the cannibalism itself. These people had been eating human flesh for so long that it had become completely normalized, just another part of their daily routine. They discussed the quality of different types of human meat with the same detachment that they might once have used to compare cuts of beef or pork at a butcher shop. Louis Keseberg, who had become the dominant figure at the lake through his apparent comfort with cannibalism and his willingness to take meat from anyone who died, had grown fat while others starved. When questioned about his plump appearance, he explained that he had been more efficient than others at utilizing all available food sources, including parts of human bodies that others were too squeamish to eat. He had eaten the brains, the organs, the marrow from bones, everything that could provide nutrition. He had also, according to whispered accusations from other survivors, been helping weak people die so that he could have access to fresher meat. Keseberg always denied these allegations, but the suspicion followed him for the rest of his life. The rescue process was complicated by the fact that not everyone could be evacuated immediately. The survivors were too weak to travel long distances, the weather was still dangerous, and there weren't enough rescuers to carry everyone who needed help. Heartbreaking decisions had to be made about who could travel and who would have to wait for subsequent rescue parties. Mothers were forced to choose between their children, deciding which ones were strong enough for the journey and which ones would have to stay behind. Husbands had to decide whether to go with the rescuers or stay with wives who were too weak to travel. Children as young as 8 years old were asked to make adult decisions about whether they felt strong enough to attempt the dangerous journey over the mountains. Margaret Reed faced an impossible choice when the rescuers told her they could only take some of her children on the first trip. Her baby, Thomas, was too young for the journey, but her older children might be strong enough to travel if they left immediately. She chose to send her 3 older children with the rescue party while staying behind with the baby, knowing that she might never see any of them again if subsequent rescue efforts failed. The journey out of the mountains with the first group of survivors was a nightmare that nearly killed several of the people they were trying to save. The rescued survivors were so weak that they had to be carried much of the way, and their bodies were so damaged by months of starvation that they couldn't digest normal food without becoming violently ill. Several people died during the evacuation, their bodies simply too damaged by malnutrition and exposure to recover even with help available. The second rescue party, led by James Reed himself, reached the camps in early March and found even fewer survivors in even worse condition. More people had died since the first rescue, and those who remained were barely clinging to life. The evidence of cannibalism was even more extensive than before, with piles of human bones surrounding every shelter and body part stored like meat in a butcher shop. Reed was reunited with his wife and surviving children in a moment that was both joyful and heartbreaking. Margaret had lost significant weight and aged years in the months since he had left, but she was alive and so were their children. However, the family that was reunited was not the same family that had been separated back in October. They had all been changed by their experiences in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The children, especially, had been traumatized by months of witnessing and participating in cannibalism. They had seen their friends and neighbors die and then watched their parents cut up and eat the bodies. They had been forced to consume human flesh themselves to stay alive. They had learned that all the moral rules they had been taught could be broken when survival was at stake. These experiences left psychological scars that would never fully heal. The third rescue party found only a handful of survivors still alive at the lake in April. Most of the people who had been left behind were dead, and those who remained were in such poor condition that their survival seemed miraculous. Among the dead was Tamzine Donner, the educated woman who had chosen to stay with her dying husband rather than save herself. Her body was found with her skull cracked open and her brains removed, leading to speculation that she had been murdered for her meat rather than dying naturally. Louis Keseberg was found alone in one of the cabins, surrounded by more human remains than anyone could count. He had not only survived the winter but actually thrived, maintaining his weight and health while everyone around him died. When questioned about the bones and body parts scattered around his shelter, he claimed that all of the people had died naturally and that he had simply made efficient use of the available resources. When asked specifically about Tamzine Donner, he said that she had died of illness and that he had processed her body the same way he had processed all the others. The final count of the Donner Party tragedy was 48 survivors out of 87 original members. 39 people had died in the mountains, most of them during the horrible winter at Truckee Lake. But the number of deaths didn't capture the full extent of the horror because it didn't account for the psychological and moral destruction that had been visited upon the survivors. The people who emerged from the mountains in 1847 were not the same people who had entered them in 1846. They had been fundamentally changed by their experiences, transformed from civilized human beings into something else entirely. The survivors dispersed across California, trying to rebuild their lives and forget what had happened to them in the mountains. Some were successful, managing to create new families and new identities that allowed them to function in normal society. Others were haunted by their experiences for the rest of their lives, unable to escape the memories of what they had done and what they had witnessed. The children who survived faced particular challenges because they had to grow up with the knowledge of what they had been forced to do to stay alive. Some became productive, successful adults who channeled their traumatic experiences into positive contributions to society. Others struggled with mental health issues, antisocial behavior, and an inability to form normal relationships with other people. Many of the survivors never spoke publicly about the cannibalism, creating elaborate alternative stories about what they had eaten during the winter to avoid admitting the truth about their actions. Others became obsessed with the events, telling and retelling their stories in ways that often changed over time as they tried to make sense of their experiences or cast themselves in a more favorable light. The story of the Donner Party spread across America quickly, but it was immediately sanitized and romanticized by newspapers and popular writers who wanted to focus on the heroic aspects of the rescue efforts rather than the horrific details of months of systematic cannibalism. The survivors themselves often contributed to this sanitization because they wanted to be seen as heroes rather than cannibals, as victims of circumstances rather than participants in acts that violated every moral and religious principle they had once held sacred. But the truth couldn't be completely buried because there were too many witnesses, too much physical evidence, and too many detailed accounts from multiple sources. These people had eaten each other, and they had done it not just once or twice in desperate moments, but systematically, methodically, and efficiently for months. They had turned cannibalism into a way of life, a survival strategy, a business model where the weak fed the strong and the dead fed the living. The legacy of the Donner Party extends far beyond the individuals who lived through the experience. Their story became a permanent part of American folklore, but it was a story that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature that most people preferred not to confront. It showed that ordinary, civilized people could become cannibals under the right circumstances. It demonstrated that moral principles and religious beliefs could be abandoned when survival was at stake. It proved that the line between civilization and savagery was much thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The Donner Party's experience raised questions that remain relevant today and that become more urgent every time civilization faces a crisis. How long would it take for us to start eating each other if our food supply was cut off? What would we be willing to do to keep our children alive if all other options were exhausted? Where exactly is the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior when survival is the only consideration? These are questions that most people don't want to answer because they're afraid of what they might discover about themselves and their own capacity for moral compromise. The story forces us to confront the reality that we are all potential cannibals, all capable of crossing lines we never thought we would cross, all just a few missed meals away from abandoning everything we think makes us civilized and human. If this raw, unfiltered examination of one of America's darkest survival stories has shocked you, disturbed you, or made you question what you thought you knew about human nature, then please hit that like button to let us know this kind of honest historical content resonates with you. Subscribe to our channel for more uncensored documentaries that don't shy away from the brutal realities of what people will do when civilization collapses and survival becomes the only law that matters. Leave a comment telling us what you really think about what these families did to survive. Do you judge them, do you understand them, or do you see yourself in their choices? Share this video with anyone brave enough to confront the uncomfortable truths about who we really are when the masks come off and the stakes get deadly. Hit that notification bell because we're committed to bringing you the stories that others won't touch, the historical accounts that reveal the darkness that lives inside all of us. Thanks for having the courage to face these harsh realities with us, and remember, the difference between you and the Donner Party isn't that you're better people. The difference is that you haven't been tested yet.